No matter where he resides, for Jamil Jan Kochai, Logar will always be home, and it is Logar that he returns to for a second time in his award-winning short story collection, The Haunting of Hajji Hotak. This book carries readers through Afghanistan with beautifully complex stories of multidimensional family lines and friendships that must find a way to breathe between the lines of war. Through magical realism, Kochai writes of a young man unable to distinguish between reality and fantasy as he plays a game of Call of Duty, and a teacher who suddenly morphs into a monkey after losing his connection to his religion. We also talk about his favorite MF Doom album and if he dons his National Book Award Finalist medallion as he shops for eggs at the local grocery store. Stay tuned for another episode of the Vulgar Geniuses podcast. Are you currently looking for a bookstore that has a great selection of books? Well, Kizzy's Books and More is that bookstore. Visit www.kizzy'sbooksandmore.com to purchase your next book for our book club. Use coupon code VulgarGenius to receive 10% off the subtotal of your first order. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Vulgar Geniuses podcast. We are your hosts.
My name is Denny.
And I am Veronica. And today we have a very, 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 very special guest. I know I say this every time, but it's true. It's true. And This one is particularly special because they are our book of the month for May.
Yes, it's my month. It's AAPI. Yay!
Time to represent. And we have none other than Jamil Jan Kochai. Jamil is the author of The Haunting of Hajji Hotak and Other Stories, which was a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction. He is also the author of 99 Nights in Logar, a finalist for the PEN Hemingway Award for Debut Novel and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. He was born in Afghan refugee camp in Peshawar, Pakistan, but he originally hails from Logar, Afghanistan. His short stories have appeared in The New Yorker, Plowshares, the O. Henry Prize Stories, and the Best American Short Stories. His essays have been published at the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. Kochai was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford University and a Truman Capote Fellow at the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he was awarded the Henfield Prize for Fiction. He is currently a Hodder Fellow at Princeton University. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, this is definitely a pleasure. We loved your book. I think I've read it at least twice already. It is so good, and it is definitely the way that we wanted to start our new year for us here at Vulgar to celebrate AAPI month.
So before we get into the meat of the book, we like to get to know you a little bit more. Just kind of like rapid fire questions. To get us started. So this is a question from a friend. What is your favorite MF Doom album?
That's a great one. I think it would have to be Mad Villainy. I think that's that's I know it's kind of a boring one to say because it's everyone's favorite, but I can't deny that one.
Oh, you got to go with a classic. You know what's up.
This is also for a question from a friend. We have asked this of all of our National Book Award finalists and winners who have come to the show. Do you wear your medal everywhere? Where does it stay? In your house? Does everybody, look at it and, bow down and say all hail?
No, it's sometimes I'm tempted to wear it around the house, but no, I keep it at my parents' house, so they have a little display case that and so they have it hanging up in their display case along with all of my siblings, their photographs and their awards too. I've got some pretty amazing siblings too, so
do y'all keep count, like who has the most? Is it like competition?
My youngest sister, Brishna, she just got accepted into UCLA, which all the rest of us, we all got rejected from UCLA, and so she's got that on us right now.
Yeah, we saw you post that. Congratulations to her.
Thank you so much.
Bragging rights. So we saw your video of your unboxing this book with your dad. How did
Mhm.
he react when you told him that you've been a finalist for the National Book Awards?
Oh, he was delighted, of course. My both of my parents have been really blessed in that they've been incredibly supportive of my career, and so whenever I get the chance to just tell them another good thing, another blessing that's gone on in my life, they're overjoyed. So he was overjoyed too.
Yeah, that was a very cute video. And I see all the
Thank you.
comments like, "Oh, your dad." Everybody loves a father-son moment. So, we've talked about this. You said you have a child. When is that children's book coming out? Because I feel like you can write a good children's book.
Oh, I mean, it's funny. It's something that I've thought about before because I've been reading so many children books to my daughter Selgay recently. But there's something, I really, really admire children's books authors because there's something like very specifically attuned to children's books, and that there's like this balancing act that they play between like simplicity but also magic, and also like making sure that like it's still like it's going to capture a child's attention. Like I'm not sure if I could actually do that. It seems really impressive to me.
Oh, I
What?
I totally think that you can pull that one out if you want to.
Yes, like what do you mean? Your book was impressive.
It was magic. It was all of that.
Yeah,
How you did it for us.
so I think
Well,
we're gonna watch out for this children's book.
It's gonna happen. I
we'll
feel
see.
like it's
We'll
gonna
see. I
come.
might I might give it a shot.
So, digging through Twitter, can you talk about this new book that you've been involved? It's called Letters to a Writer of Color. And how did you get involved? And what type of piece were you involved in this book?
Sure. Yeah. The editors of Letters to a Writer of Color, they reached out to me a couple of months ago. Actually not, it was actually a while ago. But basically they had this really fantastic idea about of writing a collection of essays, an anthology of essays, gathering together an anthology of essays that specifically focused on elements of craft, focused on the perspectives of writers of color, and the sort of the things that can be sort of overlooked in a writing workshop or in a craft textbook, that's oftentimes that can be very Eurocentric in terms of how it's understanding fiction, and then of course within the states specifically very focused on white writers, and the way that other writers, specifically white American writers, have thought about craft and have thought about storytelling, right? And so it was really like I thought it was a really wonderful opportunity to be able to write about craft from a perspective that's not always emphasized, I think. And so for me, I wrote about sort of going against that old rule of showing and not telling. And so I grew up in a household where oral storytelling was really key to how I understood narrative. And so when I was writing my own books, I sort of had to resist that old rule of showing versus telling, because so much of my writing it's rooted in oral storytelling. It's rooted in this mode of summarization. And so and there's a lot of other really wonderful essays in that collection that delve into different subjects like that.
Yeah, because when we like a writer, we are obsessed in finding everything that their name is on.
Yes.
So, just so you know, that's why we're like, has he written? What's going on? What's happening next?
Yeah, because I thought this book was your debut, and I'm like, oh no, he has a whole nother book. And I'm like, dang, I wish when I found out it was too late for me to go and try to make an attempt to read it. But I'm glad that we were able to start with this particular collection that you've given the world. It is a beautiful book. And I was just curious from what you were just talking about in regards to the craft and storytelling. Like, when did you realize for you, and as a young age, like, I love the way maybe this particular person tells a story and I want to be able to do something like that?
Sure. Um, I think, in terms of writing a fiction, I think it was probably 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Like that was the first book where um reading that book, there were so many elements of it, whether it was like the oral storytelling or like these long these big families, this rural countryside, this these long histories of violence and civil strife that existed within the country that 100 Years of Solitude is set in. It seemed to reflect back to me like so many elements of my own upbringing and of my family's lives as well, that once I finished that book, and I thought it was so beautifully written, and of course then translated into English, that I was left in awe of it. And it was this weird feeling of like I felt like I could never like write anything similar to how incredible that book was, but there was also something inspiring in the attempt as well. And so I would say it was after 100 Years of Solitude. I was probably like 18 or 19 years old, that I was like, okay, I have to, even if I fail, I have to sort of try to give this a shot of writing a book in this mode or something similar to it.
So, for those who might not know, could you give like a quick synopsis of what the Haunting of Hajji Hotak is all about?
Sure. Yeah. It's a collection of short stories. They can vary from subject to subject, but in general, it's largely about this one Afghan American family residing in West Sacramento, California, and just the different sort of extenuating circumstances of their own lives. I think one of the things that I was trying to accomplish with this book was to see all the different ways that I could write about and think about this family, and whether that's from like different character perspectives, different point of views, or also like different genres as well. So in some of the stories, it's more sort of like written in the realist mode, and then in other stories, it delves into surrealism or magical realism, and so I think like I was just trying to figure out all the different ways I could create trouble for this family and see what would happen to them. And so largely, it's about this Afghan American family and their own histories of how they got to the States, and how they're living within the States now, and what their futures might look like.
So, the title story, I was curious as to know, was the title story the foundation of your collection? I know sometimes you go through, you might have a different book that you've written within the collection that you're like, okay, I want to take this and it be the starting point of my spider web of this collection.
Mm-hmm.
Or other times people are like, I like this title, let's put this one on the book. And I was just curious too, what was the foundation of the collection that it was built upon, and how did you choose that particular part to be the jumping off point for this book?
I would say the foundation of the collection was probably Saba's story, which is it's funny because I don't know if it's like one of the more often read stories in the collection, because the other ones were Playing Metal Gear Solid and Haunting were published in the New Yorker, so I often hear about those ones. But Saba's story was one of the earlier. I think it might be the earliest story in the whole collection, and it gets at, I think, a lot of the themes of the book in terms of like passing down trauma and storytelling and oral storytelling, and these histories of colonization and occupation and warfare, and relationships between mothers and fathers and the children, and these different generations. And so I think quite a few of the stories in one way or another sort of stem out of Saba's story.
Yeah, I really love it when we're reading a short story collection. I think
my
that's
favorite. It's my favorite.
If Denny had her way, that's probably all that we would read.
Yes.
No shade to the other books.
I specifically like, we're reading this book. I don't know when or how, but we're gonna make it happen. I love it. It never fails. Like, I don't think I've read a short story that, I mean, there was some, back in the day, but I think of all the picks that we're doing, and especially yours, is the subject matter is the same but also very different, you know, like
Yeah, totally.
because we read books all about people of color, so you know it's a shared experience, but then all of a sudden another door opens and we see
A
this.
brand new world like
Yes,
open.
That's
Yeah.
yes,
great, yeah.
and this one is definitely great.
Yeah, and there's nothing more special than to read a short story collection that has all of these different connections throughout the story and these different webs. All of these stories are amazing, but one of them that definitely sticks out for us the most, that we read in the book, is Bakhtawar and Miriam. It
Yeah,
has this very like pure and simplistic presentation, making it one of the most standout stories of this collection.
sure.
You could feel their deep concern and love for each other when reading this story. Why was it important to include a story like this in the book for people to read?
Well, Bakhtaura Miriam, it's one of those stories where, like, I totally agree. It's really different than the other stories. Like, I think a lot of the times when I'm writing a story, like one of the things that captivates me about storytelling and about writing is messing around with genre. It's delving into the surreal or into the magical, or sort of messing with reality in different ways. But for this story, I just really wanted to tell more of I don't want to call it simplistic, but more of like sort of this traditionally oriented story of this pair of friends, and of how like these different circumstances in their lives can sort of bring them together, and then bring them apart as well. And so for me, it's sort of the idea that came into my head as I was actually reading this news story about this young couple in Afghanistan, and they were in love and they wanted to marry one another, but both of their families were from like rival tribes, I think, and so they weren't allowing them to get married. And so instead of like getting their family's permission, which is like, it's a huge deal in Afghanistan, they just fled from their families, and they decided to run off together and be in love on the road, right? And so I heard this story, and I thought it was a really lovely story, but then the sort of the question that popped up into my head is like, well, what happened to those families that they left behind, or the siblings that they left behind, or the people that they really, the people that would really love them and miss them, and that didn't want this tragedy to happen in the first place, right? And that's where sort of the idea for the story came about. And from that point, I was just trying to figure out, who Bakhtawara was, who Miriam was, and from that point forward, see how I could cause as much trouble in their lives as I could, while still trying to, while still being as sort of tender and vulnerable with them as possible. It was really like it was a delight to write this story.
Yeah, it's definitely a delight to read, because there's nothing like writing a story, or reading a story rather, of a friendship like this. Like, it was just so beautiful and tender, and how both of them really truly cared for each other, and wanting to have that connection. And it makes me think about, the thing that we all go through as we continue to get older, because you're thinking like, your best friends, you're going to be best friends for life, right? And then life
Yeah,
happens, and you see people get married and have children, and you don't call as much, you don't see each other as much, and you can see that start to happen, as we get closer to the wedding day, and they're having these conversations together. But yeah, like this one was probably one of my favorite stories within the book.
oh, thank you so much. Yeah, that means a lot. It was special to me.
So let's go to this character named Watak.
Okay, yeah.
So in Tagalog, because I'm Filipino, in Tagalog, Watak means wildly scattered, or disunited, or found in
Oh
different
wow.
groups.
Oh
So
wow.
with that understanding, for me, it gave me a more intentional way of reading the text, and
Yeah,
try to understand characters in a different way. It like kind of put another layer for me when
sure.
reading your book. So your stories have a common thread of separation.
Yeah,
Separation due to war, to conflict, and even poverty. So in the first story, you know, he was already mentioned as someone that we lost due to the said causes. What was it to have, you know, to write this character, you know, that we also know that's found in your life, to be the point of connection about these stories, about leaving a place or this earth and ultimately being separated?
Yeah, you know, I mean, as you mentioned, the sort of the character or the figure of Watak, it's based on like an actual person that existed in our lives. You know, when I was young. We used to have this. We have this photograph up in our prayer room at all times, and it was a photograph of Watak, and it was from when he was 16 years old. And I'd always heard all these stories about Watak. He was my father's younger brother, and he was killed during the war. And his death, it was really sort of the main, it was really the central reason, I think, that my father and his family finally decided to leave the country. Before then, they were very determined to resist the occupation for as long as they could and to stay with their land. But the death of Watuk is what really sort of spurred their migration from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and then, you know, eventually all the way to Sacramento, California. And so he was sort of this, he was like this, he was sort of this odd, sort of ghostly figure in my life, where he was, you know, he was this uncle that I'd never met, but that I'd heard so many different stories about him from so many different people, that I felt like I almost sort of like really intimately knew him, even more so than people in my actual life, people that I'd visited or known. And from a very young age, I sort of understood that there was a lot to the story of Watuk that I didn't understand, and that there was something about his loss and the way that it affected my father in particular. That there was something like there's something about that trauma and about that form of grief and mourning, like it was locked away inside of himself in a way that I could never really comprehend. And so as a child, I remember like that was all I wanted. Like I wanted to understand that feeling of loss. That like what did his loss do to my father, and how did that shape the rest of his life? And not just my father, but my grandmother as well, and Watuk's family as a whole. And so, you know, when I first began writing my first novel, 99 Nights in Logar, that whole novel sort of circulates around the story of Watak. And then again with the collection of short stories, The Haunting of Hajji Hotak, he's sort of this figure that just keeps popping up in my writing. And it's not even, you know, I wouldn't even say it's like immediately or like immensely purposeful, but there's just, you know, he's sort of, I write a lot about my family. I write a lot about my father and my mother and my grandmother, and everything that they've gone through. And so because of that, you know, Watuk is sort of this central figure that it feels like everything is sort of circulating around him and his loss. And so oftentimes so then he becomes this recurring figure in my writing as well.
Mm. Let me ask you, you know, you mentioned that you include your family a lot within this book. What
Sure.
what power comes to an author when using their own upbringing and stories and memories in this fashion within storytelling? And what has it been for you and for your own family to see themselves intertwined within this book in this way?
I mean, you know, it's one of those things where, for example, like I very rarely have trouble with writer's block in terms of coming up with material. So you know, I have trouble all the time. Like, you know, I'll be in the middle of a story and I'll hit a wall and that. But in terms of like actual content of, you know, what do I write about next? Like that's never an issue for me, because of like just the abundance of incredible stories that I grew up with and that continue to be a part of my life. So, you know, when I was just last year in September, I went back to Afghanistan for a month to visit my relatives there. And again, like it was this immense feeling of like just being sort of inundated or surrounded or almost overwhelmed by all the different stories that they were offering to me. Just but because by then, like they sort of know I'd sort of developed a reputation. I was the writer in the family, and so it's one of those things where there's certainly there's power to it. There's I think there's an organic nature to it. Like it feels very natural to write about these people that I love and that I know like very intimately and that I know very well, and then to and sort of use those as sort of a basis to explore my characters and the relationships in my stories. But then I do also at the same time feel like a great deal of responsibility and of like this pressure to make sure that I'm also getting their stories right, and that I'm not doing a disservice to their stories and to their memories and to their experiences. So it's kind of like it's a two-sided coin. There's something about that it does feel immensely right. It feels natural, it feels organic, it feels powerful. And then the other side of the coin, it also can it can also be very anxiety inducing, and it can feel like that I then have pressure, a great deal of pressure, to make sure that I do like that I honor their stories and that I write them as beautifully as I can.
Has everyone in your immediate family read your book?
Yes, yeah, they're told they've all read the. My parents, they don't read English, so sort of I'll explain the stories to them, and I did the same thing with my novel. But my siblings, like they're one of my first readers. Whenever I finish a story, I'll send them the first people I send it to are my little brothers and sisters, because they can be pretty brutal as critics. So I find that helpful.
But I think to me, it's like what a blessing to be able to pass on those stories, because not everybody is given a chance to do that. Because we've spoke to authors of just and I think it's very common for people of color, that is our way of communicating and making sure that our culture is preserved for the next generation. And I think it's just such a blessing to see two books made by you, and continue you'd continue be making stories for these people, so the world can know another part of the world. But talking about going back home to Afghanistan, most of your characters always find a way to go back to Logar.
Yeah.
And they're either a phone call, something like you gotta come back here, crazy stories. So they're basically tethered to this place, wanting to live out the memories that can be seen as something, maybe very painful. But for somebody who is also not from here, from the United States, I kind of know how my body feels when I go back to like my place of origin. What was it like to write about always trying to find home? And what does it really mean for a place like Afghanistan?
Well, it gets very complicated. I think one of those things is I grew up largely in the States. I came here when I was a year and a half. So I grew up here in the Bay Area, Hayward, California, and then also Sacramento, California. But from a very, very young age, like my whole conception of like what a home was, it was Logar. Like all the stories that I grew up with, all the memories that were told to me, it was always about Logar. It was about this small rural village in the countryside of Afghanistan, filled with fields and orchards and dirt roads. And that was home, and that was the place where my parents grew up, and it was where my aunts and uncles grew up, and it was where my grandparents grew up, and so on and so forth. And so for me, it was always this I sort of carried this concept of this lost home with me throughout my entire life, and it became sort of the central way that I thought about storytelling as well, like, because everything was oriented around this place that my family had lost to the war. And so I was also fortunate in that, my family made this really concerted effort that we visit back as often as we could, because we still had relatives there. And so, I visited in 1996 when I was 6 years old, and then again in 2005 when I was 12 years old, and then again in 2012 when I was 19 years old, at these really sort of pivotal moments of my life. And each experience was really it was really like for me, like completely perspective changing, and going back there and seeing my relatives, and reconnecting with my relatives, and seeing the village again, this place that for so many years had been sort of this imaginary location in my head, this setting for a story. To see it laid out before me was really like was really awe-inspiring, and it stayed with me for so many years afterward. But even beyond that, I just think my family in particular, we have such a unique and interesting relationship with Logar in particular, because of, as you mentioned, like physically visiting the location is not the only way that you maintain the connection, especially as time passed, and as we got as we got internet and Logat, and we got Zoom, and we got Skype, and we got, we were able to make phone calls and visits, and all these sorts of things. There were all these different ways that as you mentioned, like, even though we were apart and we were away from Logat, we remained tethered to the land in one way or another. And thinking about Marquez in particular, there's a part early on in 100 Years of Solitude where the matriarch of the Buendia family, the central family of 100 Years of Solitude, she says something akin to you don't belong to a place until someone you love is buried under its ground. And so for my family in particular, because we'd lost Watak in Logad, and because my father had lost his younger sister in Logad, and because my mother had lost two of her brothers in Logad, and they're all still there, and they're all still buried there. Like there's something about that loss, and of having those family members and loved ones like buried in that land, that like it feels like it's almost impossible to then escape from it. Even, not that we want to escape, but we remain tethered in that way as well. So there's all these, like, there's these connections to the land itself, and then there's these technological connections, but then there's these emotional connections as well. And I try to draw upon all of that for my stories.
Let me ask you, in regards to like your migration from Afghanistan to California for your family, and your father getting to California, how did he know, like, this is it, I don't want to move anymore, that this is the place? Do you know how solid he was in that choice of making California like y'all permanent home?
Well, it's really funny you asked that, because he wasn't sure at all. When my father and his family first got to the States, their whole mindset was like, how long do we have to stay here before we can go back? And so, like, for my family and my father, I remember he would describe this to me. They were just waiting for the war to end. But what ended up happening is, the Soviet occupation, the Soviet war, it happened it occurred in 1979, when my father was he was about 17 years old then. And the Soviet Union didn't end up withdrawing from the country until 1989, and then immediately after that, the country fell into civil war, and then it was a decade of civil war, and then immediately after the civil war, by then 20 years had passed. My father had spent more of his life in the States than he had in Afghanistan. And then after that war ended, then the U.S. occupation began, and now there was a whole new war. And so, it's been my parents, my family, unfortunately, it's like they've been waiting for this war to end for now more than 40 years, and more than half their lives, a majority of their lives, they've just been waiting for this war to end. And so, it was one of those things where my father, he came to Alabama before he got to California, and the Alabama, he knew for sure, like, that's not where he wanted to stay. Just because there just wasn't a lot of Afghans there, and there wasn't and so when he got to California, one of the main reasons was because there was this huge Afghan American community in Fremont at the time. And so I think that's part of probably one of the main reasons that him and my family as a whole, that he felt comfortable about staying in Sacramento because of the community, and so that's one of the things that, it remains important to me as well. Like, as much as I have issues with with America as a nation state, or as a government, or as a military entity, Sacramento does very much feel like home now.
Mm. So, Return to Cinder was a gut-wrenching story that encompasses what many people wish that they could do, but don't, because one of what is given in exchange for coming home, sometimes you have to give up certain things. And
Yeah.
this particular story, we see that the son's body, it feels that the body is indicative of the body of the country that is Afghanistan, of this like stripping away of the people and the
Sure.
culture there until there is almost nothing left. But
Sure.
yet there are those that have no desire to abandon this part of the world that they lay claim to. Is this a correct assumption to make of this particular part of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of those stories where it came out of a story that I'd heard from Afghanistan, that that this child had been kidnapped, and that the kidnappers were sending the body parts of the child back to the parents in order to get the ransom from the parents quicker. And so it was one of those things where, like, I'd heard that story, and it was shocking and horrifying. And it was one of those stories that, like, I couldn't get it out of my head either. And so so eventually I sort of like, this question popped up to me, like, how would a parent actually respond to that? How, and especially if they had come to Afghanistan with like the express purposes of, like, either like reuniting with the homeland, or of helping the homeland, like what would that do to their conception of the country? And so from that point on, then the story, it takes this surreal turn, and she begins to put the pieces of the body back together. But I think you're exactly right. I think there is something there about like this attempt to repair the nation as a whole, or to repair the community after years of warfare and years of like intense horrific violence. And whether or not that's sort of an attempt to make to repair this torn apart being, this violently destroyed being, whether or not that would actually be doomed, or if it's worth, or if it is in fact worth the endeavor itself. And so yeah, I think that's a fantastic reading of the story.
Like, this story, on a superficial level, first, I'm a parent, and then second, I also work in the medical field. So this story destroyed me. And I literally had to like pause and be like, you know what? I think I'm done reading for today, and we're gonna come back tomorrow. But that story made me feel, I'm like, this is why I can be invested in this book. That like really made me like completely, I guess, invested in the next stories that we're about to follow. And it was such, like, you use like magical realism and sometimes sci-fi fantasy in your writing and in other stories, but I think that was like a great, like, almost kind of like shocking the soul of like, this is what you're in for when you read my book. I just wanted to let you know that, because I'm like, man, we're in the second story and I'm already destroyed. I was stumped. So thank you for that. I just thought you needed to hear that.
No, it's one of the reasons why, like, I decided to start with playing Metal Gear Solid, because I think it's more of a it's an easier story to get into. It's a little bit more fun. It's fast paced. And then but you're exactly right. One of the reasons why I wanted to put Return to Sender second was that I did want to sort of just let the reader know that this is what they're sort of getting into. And and it's just it's one of those aspects where I think when when you're writing about warfare and when you're writing about violence, like some of the writing can be like really very difficult, you know, as difficult as it was for you to read, like it was very difficult to write at times as well. And you know, I'm a person that like I don't I find writing violence very, very difficult. Like it's something that I steer away from. But it was also something that, you know, when I'm trying to understand myself as a writer and my own tendencies, and I see myself straying away from something or being afraid of something, like that oftentimes like that can sometimes tell me that in fact like there's something there that I need to explore. You know, I think it was Flannery O'Connor. She said something like the writer never blinks. Like they have to look at what needs to be looked at. And so that was one of those stories where, you know, where it felt very necessary to engage with like some of the deepest horrors of living in a war zone and of living in an occupied country, and to try to come to terms with that in the narrative itself.
That's such a perfect quote to accompany this piece, because it's like, not only can you not blink when like telling this story, is because like you need to show people like this is where we are and this is where we're going, and what could possibly happen if you know, if we all end up collectively blinking, like we could just miss
Right.
everything.
That's
And
right.
like upon reading your story, it made me think like back in January I had just finished reading Octavia E. Butler's Kindred for the very first time. I had never
Oh, wow.
read her work,
Yeah.
and I'm so glad that I did, because then I realized that it served as a template for so many stories that I've read and movies and TV shows that I've watched,
Mm.
with her ability to use magical realism, sci-fi in the manner that
Mm.
she does. And
Yeah.
in your book, we see that magical realism being used throughout this collection. What is it about this particular literary device that allows you to tell the story that you want readers to take in?
You know, that's a really great question. I think with this collection, it did vary a bit from story to story. So with like the story of the tale of Dolly's reversion, for example, like that was a story where that was something, that was a story that I grew up with when I was little. My grandmother used to tell us that if we crossed the prayer rug while someone was praying, that we would turn into a monkey. And so, you know, when I was a child, I literally believed this, and it was a part of my reality. And I would stop. Well, if I saw someone crossing the prayer rug or about to, I would like jump at them to make them stop. And I remember that, and it was something. So that was like a story where it's like, let me just. I was sort of in that headspace. I was thinking about those memories and those stories. I was like, and basically this idea came up to me. I was like, like what kind of a character would that be the worst thing to happen to? And I landed like, what if it happened to like this agnostic PhD student who's like struggling with his faith in Islam? And so that's who I decided, that's who I'm going to turn into a monkey. And then it, you know, it just gets more and more wild from there. And the challenge with that story was just like, let me see what I can pull off and still keep the reader like it, you know, keep them seduced by the story. But you know, with other stories, including Return to Sender, the surrealism and the magic of those stories, I think it really does stem from sort of the absurdity of war itself. You know, it was one of those things when I got to the state, when I would visit Afghanistan, and when I would talk to my relatives about their experiences and about the way that they understood the world and that the way that they lived in the world, right? And every aspect of their lives was tethered around and was orchestrated through the experience of the U.S. occupation, right? And so it was one of those things where, you know, where they could go and who they could, you know, who they could visit and what they could be. It was all determined by the war itself and by these checkpoints, and they'd gone through such horrifying events throughout their lives that it bordered on the surreal, you know, the immense violence that they'd seen in the country, and body parts torn apart, and executions and decapitations and all these things. And then on top of all of that, they had it was the surreal nature of the war itself, where like they were literally afraid of like these killer robots in the sky that could kill them at any moment. And so there was something about that felt like, it felt almost science fictional to me. It felt immensely surreal to me. And so I think in order to, and then even beyond that, and I apologize, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit here, but there was also like other elements. You know, my parents, when they lived through the Soviet occupation, they would tell me stories about people, like young children getting killed in bombings, but their bodies being like totally preserved, like beautifully preserved afterward. And it was one of those things where like my initial inclination is to not believe the story. You know, it's just like, you know, and to be like, you know, it's probably something passed down, or it just happened to be that way. But then another part of me is also like, it questions like, why don't I believe the story? Like, why do I doubt their particular experience? Why do I doubt their particular perspective? And so I'm always like, I'm always struggling with that in my narratives as well. Like how far can I push a story? When does reality start to stop feeling like reality? And how does all that all get messed up by the absurd conditions of a war? And so that's why I think that's one of the main reasons why I like to experiment with genre so much in my work.
Yeah, that story was definitely one of my favorites with Dully and the goats.
Somebody's
Yeah.
turning into a goat, into a monkey, you know.
Right.
But I'm glad that you mentioned, you know, like the reality of like the older people that have lived before you and the stories that they tell, because that's
Sure.
exactly what my grandfather would be doing. He was a young boy when World War II happened in the Philippines. And he
Yeah.
would always tell this story, and he would always cry when telling the story that his father left him in the front of a church for him to basically starve and die.
Oh wow.
And because they cannot feed another mouth in their home.
Oh wow.
So but then he doesn't know how long he's been staying in front of the church, but at some point his own father came back for him. And you know,
Mm.
like even from that core memory, like knowing you would have turned that into this whole different story of like,
Mm.
you know, what could have happened to him in that
Yeah.
hour. It could have been a
Yeah.
day, it could have been a week, it could have been a month. But you know,
Yeah.
you don't question those experiences because they lived through it, and maybe in their head it was like a long day, but maybe it was just for the day, you know. But
Mhm.
it's it's very it's very like grounding to like read your story, because it almost speaks like, you know, the basic human existence, and like what we as humans like look for, and
Yeah.
what we like to preserve, you
Yeah.
know, like just love and family, and just knowing that the people that we care for are okay. And I
Yeah.
think that's why I really related to your book a lot. And you know, that's why I think um we've talked to a lot of people that have been on the list for the National Book Awards, and besides the craft that on how you guys write the book, the amount
Yeah.
of like, you know, research or like for you like experiences come through it, I think it's
Sure.
about mostly on human experiences and how humans can like thrive and, you know, be in communion with other people, that makes these people, whoever are the judges are, be like, oh, that is a great book. So I just
Mm.
wanted to let you know, like you did it.
And
Thank you
and this
so much.
book, it just occurred to me like, if I were to take a poem and say this poem is what this book is about, would be Lucille Clifton's "Won't You Come Celebrate with Me What I
Oh,
Have Made into This Life." And the
yeah.
ending part of thinking of like knowing that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed, and to think about like, you see this story of this family that has migrated and gone through all of these things and had all of these things happen, and yet they are still here having those stories be passed down and told and spread out to the world in this way. It is just a beautiful thing.
Thank you. Thank you. That really, you know, it really means a lot. And I really, I agree immensely with both of what you are saying, because, you know, there is this feeling like, with my parents in particular, that the things that they had experienced during the Soviet occupation with the bombings and the massacres and the shootings, and their entire village was literally, it was like leveled, and they had not even like their graves were safe. The graveyards would get destroyed in the bombings. And it's one of those incidents, it's one of those small moments in history that it feels like a blip in like over the course of human time, and I don't know how many kids could tell you about the Soviet occupation these days, and even less than that, I don't know how many people could tell you about like the atrocities that were committed in this small village in Logar, Afghanistan. But I grew up with those stories, and so it does feel like, I do have this sort of, I feel like I have kind of this responsibility to make sure that, back to that idea of like not blinking, of making sure that people don't look away from this, and that they know that this event happened, that these people died, and that they mattered, and that trauma continues to linger on the people left behind even to this day. But with all of that, to make sure that it's still like that it's still centered and focused on the relationships between the characters and how much they loved one another and how much they miss one another. And I wanted to make sure that that wasn't lost amid all the violence and the magic as well. So thank you so much for saying that.
You have centered your stories about the life of the people of the land and how their lives have, like we've talked about, been impacted and forever changed by the war. Decentering whiteness in the stories and conveying that the Afghan or Afghan American diaspora is not a monolith in spite of this generalization presented by the media. Can you speak more on this process of like reckoning that you have successfully achieved in your book?
Well, thank you for saying that. It's one of the like I continue to struggle with it, and I'm not sure if I would say that it's been successfully achieved, but it's certainly it's one of the main endeavors in my writing. And it's one of those things where I remember like reading about Afghanistan for the first time in some of the novels that I was reading growing up. It felt like those novels were so directed toward a white audience that I felt like out of place, oddly enough, reading them. And it was this weird thing where it was like, it was a novel about Afghanistan, about Afghans, sometimes written by an Afghan writer, but everything felt as if it was being directed toward a white audience. And so that was one of the things where, it's always important for me that my readers enjoy my stories. But it was also like I wanted to be very conscious of the fact that that I was that I that I live in a white supremacist country, and that that the whole marketplace, the literary marketplace, is directed toward the white American reader, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't lose like some of the some of the elements of of my work that felt very honest and that felt organic to the storytelling, and that remained very critical of the things that the US and that the West in general, or the Soviet Union, had done to Afghanistan. And I wanted to make sure that, if I was going to have this wider audience, I wanted to be like, look, like these are the things that happened in our country, and the US government was responsible, and it's important that we do, in fact, like that there is some sort of a reckoning, if not in terms of a political reckoning or of a material physical reckoning, but that at least there was some form of like a cultural reckoning, or literary reckoning, right? There's this really great quote that I often think about by I'm forgetting the writer's name. By Viet Thanh Nguyen, who he says something like that a war is always fought twice, once on the battlefield and the second time in memory. And so it does feel like it's sort of, then it becomes up to the job of poets and critics and artists and writers to wage that second war of the memory.
I like this question because I literally was just watching I had just started a documentary on Toni Morrison today, in which when they start beginning talking about like her early work of like Sula, and the review that comes out is basically like, oh yes, this girl can write, but it would be nice to see her to step outside of just writing about Black people. and
I
to
saw
bring it
that.
into the
Yeah.
contemporary. And then, doing our research, then he finds this article in the New York Times that basically does the same thing to you in terms of
Yeah.
your book. And it's like, my God, how are we
Yeah.
still dealing with the same mess still to
Yeah.
this day of like trying to show people like the white gaze, it ain't it. Like we don't need to have that to be the center, that we live these full lives, that we have these stories to tell.
Totally.
Yeah, so that's why we talking to you.
Yes.
Because we need people to know how important it is and impactful it is, and what you learn about this world that we live in relation to yourself, and how important community is just from reading
Yeah.
your book.
And and I think that's why like this platform is so important, that like you're given this opportunity to writers to be able to have these sorts of conversations and to be able to voice, their own perspectives. Because like I totally agree, like that article in the New York Times, like that was really difficult for me to stomach, and it did feel like the reviewer was just upset about the fact that this collection wasn't centering white characters and white people and whiteness in general. And so like I'm like it's incredibly heartening to hear you say that, and for us to be able to have these conversations now. So so thank you for that.
Yeah, they don't know shit. Don't believe them. Just saying. Because I'm like, why? It's not about you, bro. So there is this saying about, there's three versions of the truth: what you think, what the other person think, and what actually happened. But we just
Sure.
recently talked to Fatima Ashkar, and they
Okay.
said that there's another version of the truth, the modified stories that people tell, and that as a collective that they believe.
Yeah.
Like we've been talking about, there are so many versions of stories written about Afghanistan. What
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
your hope for the future of how like the Afghan American canon would look like?
I mean, my hope is really that it keeps multiplying. Exactly what you said about like that there's multiple versions of the truth. Like that's something that I continuously sort of grapple with and try to engage with in my writing itself. I think there's this sort of there's a sort of odd phenomenon that can occur, especially in like wartime, where one of the things that I would do is like during the course of like research, like if I went and I asked my father to describe a particular event, a thing that happened during the war, a bombing or a killing or something like that. He would tell me one version, right? And my grandmother, who lived in the same household, who had a sort of the same relationship to the country or whatever else it was, she would have a completely different version of the story. And then my aunt would have a completely different version. And then my uncle would have his version of the story. And so just that one incident in that one household, we have like 4 different versions of the truth of this incident, right? And to me, like there's something about that can feel like really like it can feel like really troubling, because I think like as like human beings, we're used to this idea that there has to be this one version of the truth. But also, I think there's also something like kind of strangely beautiful about that there are all these different perspectives, and that there isn't just one version of the story. So when it comes to like the Afghan American literary canon as a whole, I just hope that like Afghan writers continue to be given an opportunity to tell their stories, and I hope that they keep coming at it from a variety of different perspectives and different voices and different, so that we get like a whole scope of this like really beautiful, complicated war-stricken country, and that people like begin to sort of understand that that this is an incredibly poetic and beautiful and it's a location, it's a people that have been struggling for so many years, but that their stories do deserve to be told and do deserve to be heard.
Well, we are we have one last question that we like to ask
Sure.
all of our guests when they come onto the show. And just so you know that this is not whatever answer that you get is not set in stone. It can change. For those that's listening, don't write him an email telling him why you feel the way you feel about what he says today. But we like to know, we give you 2 choices. We either
Sure.
want to know your top 5 favorite books of all time,
Okay.
Or 5 things that you're very excited. It could be about that that you have books that that are coming out, or a movie you just watched, whatever. We want to know one of the other,
Or
or a
Okay.
mix.
Okay. Let me do the 5 things I'm excited about, because so I got my dear friend Pam Zhang, her book is coming out. I don't know if you can see that.
It's censored.
It's called Land of Milk and Honey. So that's coming out. I've been reading her novel. That's been fantastic. I've also been reading. I had the opportunity. I was a judge for an award recently, so I've been reading like a lot of beautiful books by young writers. This book was fantastic. A Map for the Missing.
Yes, we talked to her. She's amazing.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, a beautiful writer. I always blank on names but I have the books somewhere around here with me. I'm surrounded by them. Oh, Akil Kumurasamy, her book Half Gods, collection of stories, fantastic. She also, I think, had a novel come out recently, so look out for that. I haven't had the chance to read that just yet, but that was fantastic. And let me see, what else do I have here? I get 2 more, right?
Yeah.
Oh, this was fantastic too. Night Crawling by Layla Motley. So that also a fantastic book. I think she's literally like only 20 years old and so incredibly talented. So that was another fantastic book. And then let me see one more. Let me do. Oh, you know what? I'll do. I read this a couple of years ago, but Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmad Sadawi. It's a book that was sort of right up my alley. It's about this junk collector who pieces together the body parts of people killed in bombings, and then creates sort of this reimagining of a Frankenstein creature. And so it's very it's like black comedy, it's satire, it's magical realism, and it's very beautifully written. So yeah, those are my 5.
All right, well, there you go. I think that's a very solid 5 list right there. No email should be coming your way.
No.
Jamil, just thank you so much for this conversation, sharing this space with us today. This was I needed this conversation. This was very good. I needed to read this book, and it has been a pleasure and a treat to have you on our show today.
Thank you so much for letting us into this wonderful world of Afghanistan, letting us into the wonderful life that you've written in these stories. Like I said, I feel very connected to the book that you've written, just because of my own personal experiences, as an immigrant, as somebody that did not grow up here and has another place that I can also call home. But yeah, it was really very refreshing to see that in another part of Asia there are other people that maybe like live the lives that the Filipinos have also lived, but back over there on the east.
Right.
So yeah, thank you so much. Your writing is very, very wonderful. I hope and wish that you would write more, and maybe that children's book to all the publishing companies over there, you know who to look for.
Well, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a total pleasure, and I've really loved our conversation today. This I can't believe the entire hour has passed by, and now I get to break fast and I go.
Yay!
All right, until we meet again, you take care. All right.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed our show.
Make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Vulgar Geniuses.
Our theme song that you're nodding your head along to was produced by Sean Kantrowitz. You can follow him on Twitter and Instagram at Sean Dammit. That's SEANDAMMIT.
Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast. See you soon.
Deuces.